And you're on.
Hi, folks. My name is Humza Kazmi. I'm a partner with the Hydra Cooperative, and I'm going to be talking about the point crawl today. The point crawl is a method that is used for letting folks explore through a section of often wilderness in an RPG. Think of it as the wilderness version of traditional dungeon framework for something like D&D. You've the dungeons that folks start out with. You have series of discrete rooms that players will go through and interact with, and moving along hallways or other passages to go between major areas. And a point crawl functions somewhat similarly. You have a series of nodes that let you that the players will interact with while moving along various pathways to explore the space that they've entered in. And traditionally, D&D Wilderness has been set up in what's called a Hex Crawl, this big field of tessellated hexes, and players can say, yes, we want to go north and then northeast, and the six faces of the hex allow for somewhat abstracted but wide open player agency, where they can choose where they want to go and engage with whatever's there. The point crawl is set up such that folks can visualize and interact with perhaps a more localized area of space in the same way that one is likely to move through a wilderness in the real world. You don't say, yes, I'm going to go north and then I will rotate 35 degrees and go northeast. You're far more likely to move along trails. You're going to follow easier pathways that exist so that you can practically move from space to space, and you're going to navigate by features like large trees, small creeks that are running through, open clearings, areas that distinguish parts of the wilderness from the broader whole that you can latch onto and build a map out in your mind. The term point crawl is one that my friend and colleague Chris Kutalik came up with, but the idea is still pretty old. You can see up on the screen, I've got one of the point crawls that we used for the module Misty Isles of the Eld, but point crawls have been used very traditionally in war games, mapping out connections and pathways between various physical locations. As you can see in this map, you have a series of individualized towns in this section of, I think, the board game A House Divided, and the ways that one might move from point to point via, you can see, roads and railroads. But point calls also have a pedigree in computer games as well. You can see this map out from Infogames, one of their text adventures. And if you think back to the text adventures like Zork and Colossal Cave, the way that those functioned is not dissimilar to point crawl also. I want to go north. Well, all right, you go north. The pathways are then north, northeast. You're standing in a clearing. There's a small house. Oh, excuse me. I seem to have clicked. There we go. But it's not exactly realistic for GMs to put together something like this, very polished and laid out point crawl when designing. You're going to look something more like this, and that's entirely legit. Point crawls can certainly feel a bit imposing, but they're there to facilitate a GM and the players exploring a wilderness or exploring other locations like city ruins or what have you. They're a tool, just like any other, that's supposed to make things easier and not something that one should feel obligated to lock down and follow fully. So there are a couple of ways to start with designing a point crawl of one's own. In the example that I've put up on the screen here, you have a pre-existing wilderness which was then converted from hexes into a point crawl with nodes like Broken Statue and Old Tower. And those are the landmarks that people are going to naturally fix on and use to help them navigate this area. And as you can see, you've got a series of smaller dots that are breaking up the pathways. General convention for point crawl usage is stating that passage between any two points or any two nodes is going to take a certain amount of time, just so that it's easier for the GM to map out how quickly players are moving through a wilderness. The way I like to set up a point crawl is to start out by thinking about what's the environment that's calling to me? What's the area that I want my players to explore through and engage with? Personally, I'm working on something in my campaign setting, Legacy of the Beehive, that deals with exploring a weird, horrible, twisted desert. So doing a little bit of research into desert's geography, the types of physical formations and terrain that one is going to encounter in the desert. Let's see. Excuse me. But as I fiddle with my tech here, once you have the overall terrain that you want to operate in, the next step I like to go for is figuring out what are the major areas that players are likely to interact with. In traditional D&D framing, those are often the dungeon sites in a wilderness that players are exploring. But they can also be major parts of the wilderness that players are likely to interact with on a substantial basis. And if you see on the slide I have up here, things like the Old Tower, that may not be a dungeon in its own right, but it's something that players may interact with substantially. You can see that there are notes for interactions that they can have there. These major sites are often locations where a faction may be headquartered or some other thing that players are going to engage with substantially. So figure out the sort of those major site nodes. Those are going to anchor the point crawl because you're going to be navigating the physical space between them, and you want to think about the relations that those nodes are going to have with each other and with the overall space. Once you have those in place, I'd go back to that list of terrain features and think about what examples are that you find interesting that you might want to have the players engage with in the point crawl. So things like the small creeks and clearings and strange magical forests that I mentioned. Those are going to be the individualized nodes that that players are going to use to navigate. And once you have a listing of those nodes, you can start figuring out where you want some of them to show up in relation to the physical setup that you've already arranged and prepared. And looking at the point crawl for Misty Isles the Eld, you can see that we have a couple of these tentpole points, things like the VAT complex over here in the center, Monument 5, and the Pagoda City. But then you have all the rest, which are smaller incidental ones that players are going to be moving through and mapping out in relation to each other. These smaller sites are the equivalent of smaller rooms in a dungeon where you've got something you're going to interact with, but sometimes it's the equivalent of an empty room. It's a striking feature that lets the players understand and visualize this as a physical space, but it's not something that's necessarily going to have a lot of widgets to interact with. And that's okay. You want to space things out. Excuse me. Sorry, it's been a long day. I'm a little bit spacey. By the way, anyone watching this live right now, if you have questions, please feel free to shout them out, toss them in the comments. I'll be able to see them and respond to them here. So you've got your tentpole sites, you've got your smaller nodes, and great. How do you turn these into something into the crawl? How do you connect them? And best practices I've seen for dungeon design to facilitate exploration seems to come back to the idea of loops, and that's just as applicable here. Loops, excuse me. Bad dungeon design, at least from my perspective, is something that's very linear. If you think, if people out there have played Skyrim and you play through some of the dungeons there, you're generally following a straight path, one room to the next, Maybe there's a side room that you poke your head into, but it's not really going to adjust things. And that's one route, very linear. You can have one that gives a lot of choice, but all that choice is front-loaded. You show up and there are 17 different rooms, each of which has a door. That's too much. Players aren't going to be able to meaningfully engage with all those 17. It's the abundance of options means that all of them wind up decreasing in functionality. But if you have loops, loops and pathways mean that players have choices of different routes that they can go through, and it allows them to have choice. Okay, we think that there's something cool down this way, one of those big tentpole sites that we want to investigate, but there's something really scary up ahead. We don't have to go down that way. We've got other options. We can double back and go to the northeast. We can try swinging around. We can find some other way to whatever we're interacting with. And that's one of the benefits of those smaller sites. They let you get a preview of what's coming on up ahead and allow the players space to make decisions. Players may come across a bridge that lets them look down into the valley below and see the major tentpole sites that they want to investigate. But as you're going down from that bridge to the valley, the paths that you're going to have ahead of you are likely not going to be direct and straightforward. You're going to follow the terrain that's been shaped by game animals and erosion and weathering, and you're going to be following paths that are likely curving and doubling back on themselves as you follow the land. And if we go back to the analogy of the dungeon, in the dungeon, theoretically, if players are determined to dig through from one room to the next, that's something they can do. A point crawl isn't a rigid absolute, but those are the ways that terrain is going to channel and players are most likely going to engage with. Just looking at the comments over here, Michael was commenting about the rock that looks like a face. I think that was the cover image for this session. That was the Zardoz-esque head from Slumbering Ursine Dunes. Asher is asking about hex crawls, and Michael is quite correctly pointing out that we've got a panel on hex crawls coming up in 45 minutes by Michael Shorten, Chicago Wizard, one of the excellent old school bloggers out there. Strongly recommend checking out his stuff, and strongly recommend checking out his panel in a little bit. Richard, can you put up Pat's question here? Do you tend to employ random encounters in between nodes? I prefer to have random encounters at nodes rather than in between, just because it's easier for the GM to manage, and the cognitive keeping the cognitive process as simple and easy as possible. That said, traveling between nodes does tend to take time, and it's entirely legit to have random encounters show up there as well. I'd rather have the pressure of the random encounter and the players getting to know what's going on around them from multiple vectors, both the random encounters and the nodes that they're running into. Okay, we can take the question down, I think. Let's see. If enough of you are out there, we can even try designing a point crawl together, figuring out the best framework and possibilities, because we've got 40 minutes left if folks are down for that, or I can just continue talking about why one might want to use them. And actually, one more thing towards Asher's point about point crawls versus hex crawls. To me, the two are not in opposition. Point crawls and hex crawls both have utility for different ways of exploring and interacting with the wilderness. The point crawl is something that's really localized. You're zooming down into like a small area, navigating paths, and really investigating it in depth. I can speak. Whereas the hex crawl can often be for grander travel, broader, like long distance journeys. To draw an analogy here, you might use a hex crawl for the Fellowship setting out from Rivendell, and we're totally going to get to Mordor, guys, no problem. But as they explore the ruins of Moria, you might switch over to a point crawl as they're navigating these deep underground cave paths and figuring out where the heck they need to go. So, okay, yeah, let's try doing this group point crawl creation. So, if you're out there and looking at the chat, go ahead and toss out a couple of ideas that you have for the big ticket dungeons or the big ticket sites. And I'm going to go ahead and say that we'll be doing this in the woods. And we have a nice little Twiddler window up here. So go ahead and toss out some ideas for dungeons that that y'all are interested in. Somewhere in the woods, what are places that you want the players to be interacting with, the major areas? And while we're waiting, I'm going to go back to the pretty point crawl. Ours is going to be pretty too, but we need to get there first. And while I'm waiting for folks to toss those suggestions up, oh, we got one, Local Rulers Hunting Lodge. Let's go ahead and get that in there. I can. Okay, so Local Rulers Hunting Lodge is 1 point, but we're going to need more than that. And while we're pausing, I'll go ahead and start adding a few other starter ideas here. So we've got big ticket options, like the Hunting Lodge. Smaller sites. Oh, here we go. Sacrificial reflection pool. That sacrificial reflection pool. Ring of Standing Stones, and Lightning Shadow Manor. Okay, yeah, we've got a bit to work with here. So let's go ahead and put HL for Hunting Lodge, and then LSM for the manor. And keep tossing out suggestions. I'll add them as they show up. So we have these two as our main anchors. So now we need to kind of think about what the relationship is going to be between those. I mean, presumably there are people at both the lodge and the manor that one's likely to interact with. Maybe it's friendly, maybe it's hostile, but those two look like civilized, points of intrusion into the wilderness. So I think we're going to have them a little bit farther apart with the major wilderness over here in the center. And let's add SRP and stones. Okay. Go over to shapes, line. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and drop down a few points just so that we have. Oh, don't need that circle. We're not necessarily going to use all of these, but this is giving us a series of points that we can then set up those connections between and see what looks interesting and what looks compelling. Fig Grove. Fig Grove is a good one because, like I said, not everything has to be big and imposing. Fig Grove. All right, and so now I'm going to drag these smaller sites out and start using them as the connective tissue between the major sites. And next, we want to go ahead and, oh, I don't want this to be in green. Let's make this easy for people to see, to distinguish. I'm presuming that players are going to start from one of these places, either the lodge or the manor, because those seem like the areas that are going to attract outsiders coming into this wilderness, but those could just as easily be within the framework that we have here. Pointcrawls, like you saw for Misty Isles, the Pointcrawl there is based on starting at the exterior and working inward, but you can just as easily start inside and explore out from there. And over here, I've set up what you can see are basically 3 loops present. You have this over here on the left, this one here in the center, and this one down below. And this means that you've got a couple of paths that folks can take to get to the 2 sites that we've added in as the smaller nodes, the reflection pool and the standing stones. And that way, you've got impetus to, you've got different routes that you can explore once you've headed outwards. Right now, this one isn't too good because this most exterior branch only has one place you can go. So we probably want to connect that in. Give this lower node. Is the cursor showing up when I do that? I can't tell. But give that lower node a little bit of choice and a little bit of options. And when you're presenting these, you want to, it's good to try and give players a little bit of a heads up as to what they can encounter further in. So if you're starting out at the manor and trying to find that lodge, being able to see some distance in and get a hint for what else is in this forest lets you make informed decisions about what's in there, how you might want to try going about stuff. Let's see. So I'm setting this up so that right now there's only one path into the Fig Grove. And I said that you want to offer a bunch of nodes and a bunch of options, but in some cases it can be good to have like special areas that need a little bit of effort or a little bit of extra process to get into, and it's legit for those to be sort of sequestered away. Like if we shift over to Chris's map here, you can see down over at the old tower, there's a small chance that players can interact there and figure out a pathway to someplace that looks pretty terrible, but it's a sort of hidden gated area, not dissimilar to the to secret rooms that you might have in dungeons, areas which reward thorough exploration, but you may need to go through some hoops to get to. Also, if y'all have additional thoughts or additional things you want to see in this point crawl, please toss them out in the comments over on YouTube. I can keep on adding them. Let's see. All right. So I think this is a cromulent enough framework for a hex crawl, but we're going to need to do a bit more legwork to make this something that's actually usable as the basis for adventures, obviously. One thing is to figure out additional sites that that we can use as the either as tent poles or as major, smaller but still relevant places where the players are going to engage in the forest. We'll want to figure out things like the who's present in this forest, why are they there, what's going on, and once we have those, we can figure out how they're going to be interacting with the point crawl and how their presence is going to engage with the players. Pat's sorry, we just got a couple of good questions up here. Richard, can you put Michael's question up? Michael's asking, do you show the map to your players? And that depends. I tend to favor the players mapping on their own, letting them come up with their own connections and work, putting it together. But I also favor players mapping dungeons whenever possible. This is down entirely to group preference and to what the dynamic is at your table. The good thing about a point crawl is that it's easy to present an abstracted version where you can continue sketching it out for your players as you go, rather than showing them the full map. Because that way, you're still allowing them chances to explore. Drawing out the various nodes isn't going to take as much time as drawing out a full map might. If we can go to Pat's question next. Pat's asking, any chance of a party getting lost during a point crawl? I'd say yeah. If the players aren't keeping track of where those nodes and connections are, just like in the wilderness, if you're going along and you think, okay, I'm going to follow back to this big oak with the split trunk, yeah, I'm sure that those of you who've been out and exploring, maybe you can't quite get back to that one. Maybe there are a couple of other twists and turns. And if we look at the points that we have here, you can see that some of these have a bunch of different nodes going back and forth. So if you're not tracking those properly, then that's going to catch you up. But Pat might also be asking if there's a procedural chance for folks getting lost, like you sometimes have with hex crawls, where, all right, there's a 20% chance that going between hexes, you wind up actually slipping to the left or to the right, and you end up somewhere else. The way I run point crawls, I'd say probably not, because these things are a lot more zoomed in. So forgetting the node that you're on is the zoomed in version of the abstraction of artificial loss chance that that you might have during the hex crawl. So Michael's adding that as a player, I tend to map the dungeon as a point crawl anyway, basically. And yeah, that's 100% legit. I mean, sometimes for those of us with the big traditional old school dungeons, mapping out each of those squares is really important for finding those secret hidden spaces. But that's down to player, GM by GM basis. And the crucial thing is the relationship map of those various points to each other and making sure that you're able to understand and conceptualize the physical space that your characters are exploring. Excuse me. And if y'all want to toss up additional sites, please, like I said, feel free. We can start fleshing this out. Or if you have ideas for, actually, let me go ahead and add this up here. So keep sending sites, either big ticket or smaller, to factions. Who's wandering around in these woods? What's their deal? Why are they wandering around? Monsters and other obstacles, because those are also going to determine how people are going to interact with the space, how those factions are going to interact with the space. Oh, Levi's got a good question. If we can put that up. One-way connections, locked connections, and similar tricks, do you find that they work well or fall flat in the point crawl? And I mean, obviously, that's a situational thing, case-by-case basis, but I find that those are really helpful for point crawls because they wind up helping facilitate players exploring and finding other routes and substantively engaging with the space that they have. You need to do the right foreshadowing to make sure that the players can meaningfully do that they know that there's something out there to seek. But once you do that, those are helpful for driving play and for helping players put together connections. Like, locked connections are a great example of that, actually, where you can have something that that, all right, we need some way of dealing with this issue in this node, or some way of opening up this path because I can see that there are magical energy points, and we can probably get this turned into a bridge if we find the right way. That's going to get the players excited. That's going to get them trying to make that happen. That's going to get them forming connections, and they're going to be jazzed about it. They're going to be seeking to make that work. Or you could have, I get excited because that's what my group and my experience is like, but that's not always the case. You can sometimes have folks who get frustrated when they can see that there's something out there, but it can feel like they're going around circles, that that's closed off. And this is something that you have to assess based on your players. In my experience, the folks I've hung out with and interacted with, these sorts of mechanisms help drive play, but I don't want to universalize on that front. Michael's adding Stone Beehive as a location. So Stone Beehive. All right, so I've put the Stone Beehive. Richard, can you take the text down? Thank you. Okay, so I put the Stone Beehive up in a part that's still relatively connected, but slightly out of the way, because Stone Beehive to me sounds like something that's going to be a potential stumbling block or point of engagement for the players. It's one of the paths towards the sacrificial reflection pool, but it's not necessarily the only one that players have to go through. They assuming that they're coming in from Lightning Shadow Manor, they can try going around the southern path, for instance, or try curving up to the north. Or once they've got that there, they can try bring pursuers in. They can try and use the Stone Beehive as something to throw folks off their path. And the presence of the Stone Beehive there may be a good reason why traffic between the hunting lodge and the manor is a little bit tricky, is a little bit of an issue for folks. Let's see. Oh, one of the important things about Pointcrawls that's worthwhile to note here, you want to do a good job when constructing the nodes of signaling to your players how what those pathways are like. For a lot of the Pointcrawls that my crew, the Hydro Cooperative, has put out, we've abstracted those paths into, all right, the distance between any 2 points is going to be 30 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, what have you. But in order for the players to conceive of this as an actual space, you want to put a little bit of thought into figuring out what kinds of connections are extant between these spaces. And this is where a little bit of thought about what the geography is like can really help. Remember I said at the start of this that you want to have like a list of those terrain features for woods, you can have small copses, fallen trees that are shaping things around them, in the case of these pathways, things like game trails, creek banks, and whatnot, cliff faces that explain why this is an easier path for folks to move across, why it's makes sense that things are going to move this way, and also give them a taste of what else might be going through here. A game trail is obviously going to be far different than major pathway that folks from the hunting lodge are taking out into the forest to try and hunt those game. And if they're going out there regularly, like these two southeast and southwest paths from the hunting lodge, because those are the two funnel points, you can tell that those are probably going to be reasonably well trod. Those are going to be areas where if you're adjusting your encounter tables, you might be more likely to encounter things. And the players can also discern that if they're exploring and they're coming from the south up towards the hunting lodge, seeing that path gives them a little bit more. Seeing that path lets them put together connections, even if the hunting lodge happens to be hidden away and they don't know that it's out there. Let's see. We're coming up on 15 minutes before the next thing. So if y'all have any questions or you have any other locations or design ideas that you want to toss into there, now's the time to put them up. And also, confidentially, that would be good because I'm not sure what else y'all want me to talk about. But let's see. Shifting over here. Actually, as I'm waiting, Pointcrawls don't have to be restricted to the vertical. To the horizontal. The slide I've tossed up here is a slide from the Hill Cantons campaign that is showing layers of a ruined city. Let's see. Oh, excuse me. Getting distracted by the chat. Let me finish this thought, and then I'll turn back to the chat. So this this slide, you can see that you've got a top surface layer, and then different points that are, instead of being horizontal passages that you're going to, these are the vertical points that you're encountering as you're digging further and further down. If you think back to that illustration from the old BX D&D, where you have the vertical cross section of the dungeon, the point crawl helps kind of facilitate that, where you're going from slice to slice. And Levi's tossed over a couple of locations, so let's get those on there. Cave and tunnels. All right, lookout point is over there. And then let's go ahead and put cave. Okay, so I put lookout point a little bit inside the hex crawl, excuse me, inside the point crawl. So that way folks have a reasonable chance to look around and get hints of what's deeper inside. That sort of foreshadowing helps players come to decisions about what they want to explore, figure, sort of say, all right, oh, the hunting lodge is down over there. We need to find some path forward, and that helps drive the exploration down these various routes. The cave. Levi suggested a cave. Caves are awesome here because those you can use that as a meta connector for parts of the point crawl, introducing these pathways in blue that open up completely different ways to explore and engage with what's going on. So you go into the cave, you've got to go underground, there may be additional stuff, but those blue pathways let you move around the point crawl in ways that you weren't expecting before. Bandit campsite. Okay, so bandit campsite. All right, and I've tossed the bandit campsite over up onto that right-hand point for a couple of reasons. One, it's a little bit it's a little bit inside, so players won't be able to deal with that right away. But it also gives bandits access to those caves, and it gives them a way to move around the point crawl and potentially interact with the PCs in a bunch of ways. You could have bandits show up as standard random encounters in a chart, as one does, but what this framework also lets you do is track bandit movement on the point crawl and track that simultaneously with player characters. And that's relevant because if the bandits have access to this cave, they've got ways to move that the players won't be expecting. They'll be able to do all those interesting outflanking things and shift around in ways that the player characters will, number one, have to adapt to, and number two, hopefully drive the PCs onward to figure out how they're doing this and facilitate this discovery of the cave environment and the shortcuts that they can take to start exploring through. Let's see. 1 second. So I've got 10 minutes left. So just thinking about why you want to use a point crawl. A point crawl is going to be handy for deep exploration of a location. Sometimes it's that standard 6-mile hex that's so beloved in old school design. Sometimes it's something a little bit more unusual, like this underground environment or ruins underneath a city or what have you. But it gives the player characters a way to concretely explore. It zooms in on the process of exploration and helps that space become alive. If you want to get that sort of zoomed in moment-to-moment thing, that's when you want to use the point crawl and really focus on having them understand and engage with this area. Perhaps it's one that they're likely to keep on engaging with, like the area around multiple dungeons or what have you. But if you're focused on the long journey, if this isn't a place that characters are going to be engaging with deeply, but are going to just be passing through as they're moving on to a major objective that's far away, that's when you want to shift to the Hex Crawl. That's when you want to shift to a higher level of abstraction. I wish I had the more film terminology for this. If you think to those shots of in spaghetti westerns, I love spaghetti westerns, of zoomed out shots of your anti-heroes riding across the landscape, those wide open vistas, that's probably something more of the Hex Crawl. You're not really focused on those individual places, but when you want to get like deep and close and personal into what's going on, and the relationship of spaces is something that becomes far more significant, that's when you might want to go to the point crawl. Michael's asking a good question. If we can toss that up on the screen, what do you do if players want to cut through between 2 points? And sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. If you look at the map I've got up here, taken from Misty Isles the Eld, you can see that the nodes are separated out by these gigantic, like massive grub worms that are sort of infesting this island. And we included notes in there. What if the players want to climb them? What if they want to just cut directly between these two? And you can do it. It's going to take a lot of work and probably some climbing tools, but if you really want to cut across, you can. Just like if in a dungeon, players want to get pickaxes and shovels and hell with this, this 60-foot-long corridor, we're going to cut our way to the next room. That's something you can do. That's something that's viable. But then you have to be prepared for what that means. You have to put in a lot more effort and a lot more time to make that happen. Shifting over to something less fantastical than giant grubs and back to our forest example. In the forest here, you can probably make your way between 2 points without following the paths that are there. But it's going to take you a lot more time. It's going to be a lot more effort. And that's why when writing up the descriptions of the various points, even though each description may be relatively brief, just a couple of lines, you still want to have discussion of what the physical space is like. In some cases, it may be doable. Like you may have a significantly wide river that's separating out 2 points, and that's something that players with enough time and determination might be able to cross and might be able to sort of shortcut that. That's legit. But there are presumably also additional challenges, and there's a reason why everyone else goes around rather than cutting across that river. Maybe it's a hassle and no one had the axe available to build a raft. Maybe there are, maybe there's something lurking in the river that you really don't want to go near, dire hippopotami or something that are really going to mess your day up. And yeah, there's a reason why people don't go across. But for something like the forest, you might have dense underbrush that you can cut your way through, but it's going to be an exhausting, tiresome process that's going to take a lot of time. Going back to the example of the dungeon, you can dig your way through a dungeon, but it'll take you days. The forest might not take you days, but it's still going to take a lot more time. You're going to be making a lot of noise, and you're going to have a chance for a lot more random encounters. Players are likely to be heading into these with objectives. Sometimes there's one of those traditional quest objectives. Sometimes it's something a little bit more abstracted, like, yo, I want to find out what the deal is with that sacrificial pool. I want to screw around with that pool. And the more time that you're spending carving through the underbrush, that you've got less time to screw around with the pool, because you're going to be using up your time and your resources making your way through there rather than being able to get to your objective. But sometimes it's worthwhile. Sometimes you've gotten the stone bees angry over there and the other point is on fire and you just really want to get to that sacrificial pool. It might be worthwhile to cut your way through. All right, it's about 9:58 where I'm sitting, and I want to make sure that everyone, takes a bit of a break and stretches. I hope that you're going to be able to stick around for Michael's presentation coming up next here. But before I go, like I said, I'm Humza Kazmi. I'm a partner over at the Hydra Cooperative. I'm really excited for the stuff that we've been putting out relating to Pointcrawls. You can follow me online at ALLANDAROS on Twitter, and you can follow the cooperative at Hydra Co-op. And let me get those up here. You can buy our stuff over at DriveThruRPG, and possibly a couple other areas as well. Exalted Funeral has print copies of some of our work. And our next book, Lorne Song of the Bachelor, a wilderness exploration written by ZXU, is going to be coming out very shortly. So yeah, that's what we've got coming up. This has been me talking about Pointcrawls. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll also be putting together a list of resources, and I'm hoping to have a Hydrazine #1 coming out in, fingers crossed, the relatively near future. That'll be codifying a lot of Pointcrawl resources and making that something that folks can readily reference and look up. Thank you all so much. It's been a blast talking with you, and hope you have a wonderful rest of con. Have a great night, folks.